The Whistler of Windbrook Hollow. It was a cold October evening in Windbrook Hollow, a small town nestled deep in the forest. The leaves crunched underfoot as the wind carried a crisp chill through the trees. Only a few homes were scattered across the land, each one isolated by thick woods, making the town feel both peaceful and eerie. People here didn't ask questions about the past. They didn't need to. The older generation had learned to keep their heads down, and the younger ones never seemed to question the stories they heard as children. But there was one house, on the edge of the town, that people avoided, especially at night. The old Milner house. It had stood abandoned for years, its windows boarded up, and the roof caved in from neglect. Despite the decay, there was an air of mystery that clung to it, almost like a heavy fog that couldn't be shaken off. They said the house was haunted. Some said it was the ghost of Clara Milner, a woman who had disappeared from the house 30 years ago. Others claimed it was her husband, Arthur, whose madness had driven him to commit terrible acts before he vanished one stormy night. But the most chilling story of all was the one whispered by those who dared to venture close to the house at night, the tale of the Whistler. It was said that, on certain evenings, you could hear a soft, eerie whistling sound coming from the direction of the house, always when the moon was full. It was never loud, but it was unmistakable, a faint melody that seemed to drift on the wind, haunting in its quiet beauty. Some believed it was the restless spirit of Clara, while others swore it was something far darker, something that had taken hold of the house long ago. One evening, a young man named Lucas found himself in Windbrook Hollow, a place he'd never visited before. He was a writer, always on the hunt for strange stories and unusual places to inspire his work. He'd heard the legends of the Milner house and the mysterious Whistler, and decided that the eerie reputation of the house was too tempting to pass up. He wasn't a believer in ghosts. He saw them as stories to sell to curious readers, but he couldn't resist the pull of the house. He arrived just as the sun dipped behind the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest. The Milner house stood in front of him, its silhouette dark and looming against the orange sky. Lucas took out his notebook, jotting down notes about the house's state of decay. It was even more forlorn up close. The windows were indeed boarded up, and the wooden fence that once surrounded the property had fallen to pieces. The door, hanging off its hinges, creaked in the wind. As he stepped onto the overgrown path toward the house, Lucas felt a shiver run down his spine. He told himself it was just the cold, but deep down, he knew that something wasn't quite right about this place. He didn't come for the ghosts. He came for the story. Ignoring the knot in his stomach, Lucas pushed the door open and stepped inside. The house was dark, the smell of damp wood and rot heavy in the air. Dust particles danced in the beams of light that filtered through cracks in the walls. The floorboards creaked beneath his feet as he ventured deeper into the house. The walls were lined with old portraits, their frames long since cracked, the faces blurred by time. He moved through the rooms, taking notes on the eerie silence and the way the house seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting for something, or someone, to disturb its slumber. As the night deepened, Lucas found himself in the parlor, where a grand piano sat under a layer of dust. He couldn't resist. He sat down and gently pressed a key. The sound was out of tune, but it brought a strange sense of comfort. He continued to play a few notes, testing the keys one by one. Then, he stopped, thinking he heard something. A faint sound, like a whistle. At first, he dismissed it as the wind, but then it came again, clearer this time, though still distant. He stood up from the piano and listened carefully. The sound was coming from the woods. The Whistler. Lucas felt his heart race. He had heard the story. He had mocked the idea of a ghostly melody haunting the hollow, but now, with the sound drifting through the trees, he couldn't deny the chill creeping over him. Curiosity got the better of him, and he stepped outside, heading toward the woods where the sound seemed to be coming from. As he walked deeper into the trees, the whistling grew louder, and the hair on the back of his neck stood on end. It was soft at first, like a lullaby, but then it twisted into something more unsettling, high-pitched and mournful. The wind howled through the branches, but the whistle never stopped. Eventually, Lucas found himself at the edge of the woods, looking out at a small, crumbling stone structure, a well. The old well was hidden away in the forest, covered in moss and ivy, as if it had been forgotten by time. The whistling was coming from somewhere deep within, echoing off the stone walls. He approached it, his breath shallow, the hairs on his arms standing up. Then, just as he neared the well, the whistling stopped abruptly. A voice broke the silence. "Why did you come here?" Lucas spun around, his heart racing. Standing behind him was an old woman, her face pale and drawn, her eyes hollow. She was dressed in a faded gray gown, her long, silver hair hanging in loose strands around her shoulders. It was Clara Milner. The woman's gaze was piercing, her voice steady but cold. "You've heard the stories. You've come for the truth. But the truth is a dangerous thing, young man." Lucas opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He could feel a strange weight pressing down on him, as if the very air around him had become thick with dread. "Arthur is still here," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. "He's been waiting, for someone to hear him." The whistling began again, but this time it was louder, more intense, echoing through the trees, as if it were coming from the very earth itself. Clara's eyes locked onto his. "Don't listen to it. If you do, you'll never leave," but it was too late. The sound had already woven itself into his mind, filling every corner of his thoughts. It was haunting, beautiful, and impossible to ignore. Suddenly, the ground beneath him trembled. The trees groaned in protest, and the well before him seemed to pull him closer, its stone lips opening wider, as if inviting him to descend into the darkness. The last thing Lucas saw was Clara's face, a mix of sorrow and warning, before everything around him went black. The next morning, the town of Windbrook Hollow was quiet. A search party had been formed after Lucas had failed to return. They found the Milner house empty, with no trace of him, except for his notebook, left behind on the piano. The only thing that remained was the faint sound of a whistle, drifting on the morning wind. And so, the story of the whistler lived on, as it always had, in the hollow where no one dared to listen.